Okay, hi and welcome everybody to our first round of Lightning Talks. My name is Vera Lukai and I will be moderating this round. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Vienna and recently working in the research project in Heidelberg. Yeah, so much to my person. We have this lightning talk session. We have 6 pre-recorded talks with 5 minutes, and afterwards we have some time for discussion. So I would say Mary is probably starting the videos. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Violence against women and female incarceration rates predict estimated prevalence of modern slavery across countries. I'm Janine Ray, and I worked on this project with my colleague Erin Cameron and Dr. Christine Jacqueline. Since 2000, there has been a 53% increase in female incarceration rates worldwide. Internationally, females are the fastest growing prison population. Evidence suggests that specific gendered vulnerabilities and lifetime victimization serve as conduits to incarceration status for women. In many countries, such as South Africa and the Netherlands, poverty, violence, and social oppression serve as gendered vulnerabilities and risk factors for female incarceration. Further, in Argentina, violence is the strongest predictor of incarceration status for females. Research shows that women experience unique stressors for health outcomes due to their incarcerated status. Also, compared to men, incarceration is associated with moderate to severe psychological distress in females. Further, incarcerated women experience higher rates of physical and sexual violence and substance abuse, and post-release mortality rates are several times higher than for women who have never been incarcerated. More than 40 million people globally experience modern slavery, and females contribute to the largest group affected by slavery victimization. In particular, females are largely used for forced sex among other slavery roles like forced labor, forced begging, child marriage, etc. Similar to the increasingly disproportionate rate of women affected by modern slavery, women are also increasingly disproportionately incarcerated. Also, similar to the big business of modern slavery, there's a big business of incarceration, particularly in the United States. No research has yet examined the complex relationship between female incarceration rates, violence against women, and the estimated prevalence of modern slavery. We hypothesize that violence against women is a predictor of female incarceration rates across countries, and that ultimately incarceration is a form of violence against women. Further, women and girls are disproportionately affected by modern slavery victimization, and we propose that female incarceration rates and violence against women predict the estimated prevalence of global modern slavery. Analysis 1 included the predictors of child marriage rate, rape rate, the lifetime prevalence of violence against women, interpersonal violence rates, and femicide rates, with female incarceration rates as the outcome variable. Analysis 2 included female incarceration rates as an additional predictor, with the estimated prevalence of modern slavery as the outcome variable. ANOVA with backward removal was utilized for both analyses. For analysis 1, models 3 to 5 were significant. The final model had the highest effect size and included rape rate, the lifetime prevalence of violence against women, femicide, and intimate partner violence, which predicted 31% of the estimated prevalence of modern slavery across countries. For analysis 2, all models were significant. The full model predicted 78% of the variance in the outcome variable. The final model had the highest effect size, with femicide as the single strongest predictor of the estimated prevalence of modern slavery across countries. Results confirmed our hypotheses and should suggest that several forms of violence against women strongly and significantly predict female incarceration rates. Together, violence against women and female incarceration rates predict the estimated prevalence of modern slavery, with femicide as the single strongest predictor. Violence against women, female incarceration, and modern slavery are part of a complex web of intersecting factors that contribute to human rights violations against women across the globe. Thank you. And there's our contact info and a link to our references.
Eco-anxiety in youth, a scoping review of the literature. COVID-19's current social health crisis puts the well-being of children and adolescents at risk, including increased anxiety levels. It came immediately after a fall marked by climate protests in 2019. Findings in UK suggest that environmental concern increased during the COVID-19 crisis. Now discussed as an emergency, the ecological crisis causes anxiety in a growing number of individuals, especially young people. Eco-anxiety refers to anxiety and stress related to the awareness of degraded living environments. American Psychiatric Association officialized the term eco-anxiety in 2017 by defining it as a chronic fear of environmental doom. When this fear becomes too invasive, the individual's functioning could be affected. Although it may be similar to the symptoms of anxiety disorders, eco-anxiety is not listed in the DSM-5. Since the ecological crisis represents a real threat, some level of concern regarding the environment can be considered appropriate. However, it is unclear what kind of information is available in literature on the phenomenon of eco-anxiety among youth. The aims of this research are to examine the nature and extent of research on eco-anxiety in children and adolescents, and to present the main findings of the research to date. To achieve this, we conducted a scoping review basing our protocol on the method proposed by Arksay and O'Malley with recommendation from Levac, Cohun, and O'Brien. The research question was, what is the state of knowledge surrounding eco-anxiety among youth? Relevant studies were identified in 5 electronic databases used in psychology. Studies were included if they are peer-reviewed, focus on eco-anxiety, and involve children or adolescents. In June 2021, the keywords identified were eco-anxiety in order to broaden the scientific literature, finding then 38 articles. Since the term eco-anxiety seems to be little used, new keywords were added at level 2 in September 2021, which resulted in 64 additional studies. Once the duplicates were removed and those that were not available, 69 records were screened. Finally, 14 studies were included in our review. A key finding of this review is that eco-anxiety should be understood from a developmental perspective. Children's and adolescents' understanding of environmental phenomena evolve along the lines of cognitive and social-emotional development. Consequently, symptoms of anxiety and depression are experienced and expressed differently across childhood and adolescence. While eco-anxiety is documented in literature across all ages, the review shows clearer results for adolescents. They are more likely to experience environmental threat in an existential way, thus presenting symptomatology directly related to environmental crisis. The review highlights the lack of empirical research aimed at understanding the mechanism of eco-anxiety in children. Although scientific interest in eco-anxiety appears to be growing, a lack of conceptual clarity persists, particularly with respect to children's experiences. Few study it empirically with children, and when they do, the phenomenon is studied from the perspective of adults. I plan to fill this gap by conducting my doctoral thesis on the conceptualization of children's eco-anxiety by interviewing them directly. A better understanding of eco-anxiety among young people will make it possible to improve assessment and intervention practices with them and their living environments, for example, family, school, and community. To conclude, let's take action now to fight against climate change by involving the youth who will be the adults of tomorrow. Thank you very much.
We are presenting on rising waters, understanding the impact of climate change on coastal Native Americans and Indigenous peoples. My name is Monica Zabinski, and I'm presenting with my colleagues Hillary Hines, Taylor Levitt, and Dr. Leah Horvath. We wanted to acknowledge that as 4 white women living in the Midwestern region of the United States, we recognize that we cannot know of or speak for the lived experiences of this group. Our goal is not to do that. In offering this presentation, our goal was to educate ourselves and in turn, educate others. We are located in the Chicagoland region, so we wanted, out of respect, to list and show the names of the lands on which we exist.
Climate change is having major impacts all around the world, with some of the hardest hit areas being the coastal regions. These regions are impacted by rising sea levels, warming seas, and reduced oxygen. In Alaska alone, at least 17 Native American communities are in the process of relocation due to land erosion. Herscher states that Native communities are disproportionately affected by climate-related flooding, in part because of the very same history of pushing Native peoples onto marginal land. Relocation, which is rapidly becoming necessary due to shrinking coastlines, threatens the community. Displacement puts communities at an increased risk of violence and poverty. And even more so, many Native communities are close-knit and rely on each other as part of a collectivist society. Relocation typically involves disbanding communities and resettling individuals in disparate places. This leads to a loss of cultural identity, in addition to a loss of place and loss of access to culturally important resources.
In addition to displacement, traditional ways of tending to the land has become more difficult because of climate change. Commercial businesses are encroaching on the lands that have traditionally been tended to, and species are not only dying out, but also migrating, and new species are moving in that are making it more difficult for Indigenous communities to tend to the land. Research has demonstrated that Indigenous communities are very much aware of these changes. Throughout their lifetimes, they've noticed the changes in temperatures, they've noticed the changes in species, and they've noticed the changes in tide. In order to better communicate these types of things, research has indicated that community radio might be a way to better communicate with these communities by indicating specific locations and ways that they can combat the changes that are going on. In addition, utilization of colleges and universities to work with Indigenous communities to not only research the climate change, but also to help combat the changes that are happening to these communities.
Native Americans and Indigenous peoples have demonstrated their resiliency time and time again. When it comes to responding to the impact of climate change, it is no different. The Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe have resided in the marshlands of southern Louisiana since their ancestors settled there to avoid the forced relocation efforts of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. However, the island on which they reside has been virtually swallowed by rising sea levels. With governmental financial support, the tribe has chosen a relocation area that offers protection from hurricanes and flooding, but allows them to maintain their cultural identity, including maintaining traditional fishing and agricultural practices. In Alaska, the Tsetsin Tlingit Council have become innovators of biomass energy production. They have transitioned from using diesel fuel burning to wood chip boilers to heat their buildings. They estimate that these changes will keep $83,000 within their community and reduce over 7,000 tons of greenhouse gases. While these are just a few stories of how specific communities have responded and adapted to climate change, these are powerful examples of the resiliency of these communities.
And so the question comes up of what can we do and how do we share our research about climate change and meaningful action? One thing that's important to note is approaching these communities with humbleness and awareness of how climate change is specifically noticed and recognized by those within the community. One crucial thing we often overlook and forget is that these are the individuals living most intimately and coexisting most intimately with these environments. And so their experiences and awareness of the changes are super important and must be accounted for and included within any research and ongoing efforts that we make. Additionally, utilizing person-focused and culturally oriented language and terminology can help not only when we're dispersing information, but also when collecting. While we may be used to calling various parts of our environment by specific names, such as Lake Erie, that may not be the names that are used within the native lands and ancestral lands. And so ensuring we use the right terms can really help increase our mutual understanding in conversations. And finally, meaningfully connecting with these communities to learn from, rather than focusing on just dispersing information. Previous studies show that one key flaw that impacts any community participation is the lack of connection and active co-participation. Due to the history of genocide and oppression that these communities have faced, the ability to gain any ground on trust and mutual cooperation is critical and will take time and effort, and yet it can truly lead to significant changes when it comes to climate change. And so we would like to say thank you to the International Council of Psychologists for allowing us to present, and we look forward to any discussions.
Hi, I'm Elena, and I'm here with Jamie and Leanne talking about our paper towards a recentering of graduate psych statistics. So centering a variable means to set its value at zero, and then interpret all other values in relation to this reference point. Regarding race and gender, researchers often center male and white at 0, and it's typical that research vignettes and statistics textbooks are similarly seated in white, Western, and frequently United States heteronormative frameworks. So we completed a 2-stage transition. The first was from SPSS to R, and then the second was this intentional recentering of our statistics course. So this is a little bit of what we did for each of those things. We had several different classes where we looked at adding in different materials to kind of bring us back to including more diverse voices in our research.
So I'm going to jump in and take over the quantitative method portion. So as you can see on the screens, different demographic information about our participants. What I'll highlight is that they're from 2 PhD programs, clinical and industrial organizational psychology programs, and they were in 2 classes, an ANOVA class, which took place before the psychometrics class. The measures that we used to evaluate this were course evaluation data. So there were 6 items that represented socially and culturally responsive pedagogy, and then 7 items that represented more specific or more traditional elements of course evaluation. And then we broke that down into SPSS, comparing SPSS classes to R classes and pre-centered classes to recentered classes. And then the analysis that we chose to use was a series of hierarchical linear regressions. At the outset of this, we did not set an a priori theory, and we do acknowledge that we ran a significant number of tests, and therefore we have an increased chance of a type 1 error. So moving on to the results, as you can see here, this is the results for our socially and culturally responsive pedagogy items, and you have the ANOVA class in the first graph and the psychometrics classes in the second graph. And what you'll see here is some range restriction. These are the means of the scores, and there's not much deviation, which made it harder to find any statistical difference. And so what we found was that neither statistics package nor centering status had a significant effect on the 6 items related to socially and culturally responsive pedagogy. If we move to the next graph, which shows our traditional course evaluation items, you see that same range restriction with the scores. We did, however, have statistically significant negative effects on organization, clarity, assignments, and overall content in both psychometrics and ANOVA classes. And then for psychometrics alone, the transition to R had a negative effect on objectives, students' interests, and their understanding. Recentering had a statistically significant positive effect on organization for psychometrics alone. And overall, the proportion of variance accounted for was rather small, with the highest proportion of variance accounted for being 11% for clarity within the psychometrics course.
Now that's where we're going to end this lightning talk. And then I encourage you to tune into part 2, where you can hear Leanne share about the quantitative or the qualitative portion.
Thank you for tuning in to part 2. If you would like to know about our introduction and quantitative research, please refer to part 1. I'll start out with our qualitative research. We chose consensual qualitative research, the modified version, basically because it was good for a large number of participants, making it ideal for analyzing short answers on student course evaluations. And after we did that, we discovered several domains that students talked about. The first was access. They appreciated zero cost resources. So for example, using a free textbook. The next was growth, and that was a multidimensional personal and institutional growth that was described. So for example, students explained gaining awareness and, having the info being eye-opening. Another one was sustainability. And students were wondering that, for example, I think that every effort to decolonize the class builds upon itself. I wonder if we'll keep doing this. So they were basically concerned about the sustainability. The next was praise. A lot of students really appreciated the efforts, but also wondered if it was enough. So for example, a student said, mere exposure to new research, minority authors, and a decolonized paradigm, they want those things to keep going. And they basically said future work would need to help students reflect and integrate these themes. Another one was content, and that was the selection of research methods upon education resources. So for example, textbooks written by non-white authors, diverse readings, and diverse studies and journals. Another one was classroom climate. So basically the social, emotional, relational elements of the pedagogy that contributed to feeling seen and valued and safe. Another domain was white supremacy culture. And that was overall acknowledging and naming that academia is rooted in white cis male culture. And then the last one was resistance. We did have several students push back on the effort to recenter statistics by questioning its importance and relevance. And here we can see the frequency table. And this is basically just to demonstrate that there were differences across classrooms and across different types of students. And now we are going to talk about the discussion and the implications.
So for implications, one of the first things we thought about was revising material. The restricted range makes it a little difficult for any change, particularly any positive change, to be detected. So we have to reflect in ourselves on the results. We saw the significant decrease when switching to R. So doctoral programs for us began transitioning away from SPSS into R in 2019. And now students also take the class in their first year. So that could account for some of the negative impacts that we saw. And then in 2020, we obviously have the COVID-19 pandemic, which meant that classes all moved fully online, which would again create a little bit more of that negative feedback probably. And the instructor is also only in her third year of learning and teaching R. So she's kind of learning alongside the students. So there's some growth there when it comes to like organizational content. The next implication, we would really love to see our program move towards a scientist practitioner advocacy model. And this is just to infuse social justice and multiculturalism throughout the program so that we're reprioritizing our curriculum and training, and we're participating in action research, needs assessments, and program evaluation. And we're doing research that kind of matters. We also would love to see participation with multi-site collaborative studies, including community members, and research for various stakeholders that are also accessible to laypersons, so that it really matters with policymakers and we're making an impact instead of just kind of putting it in a journal and it being forgotten about. Limitations. We're obviously not able to conduct a true experiment. It would not be ethical to have someone in one class that we viewed as like not as good and have someone in, that control variable. There's also a participant observer role of the research team. So all of us have been in those classes and may even have had like responses to the survey responses. So that is also something that we had to keep in the back of our mind, and why we kept a journal as we went around to make sure we were catching any bias as it came in. Future research, we want to continue to measure trends due to the socio-political changes and the program's fluency with R, make sure that we're still moving forward in the right direction. We would love to use multi-level modeling to understand students' responses as they matriculate through the 5-course series to make sure that it's impacting them and helping them grow. And we'd love to see multi-institutional efforts by using statistics such as meta-analyses that would provide a broader view of the predictors and outcomes, so that we're getting like a bigger picture of what's going on. And that is all. Here are our references.
Hi, my name is Erin Cameron, and I'm a clinical psychology doctoral candidate at Fielding Graduate University. My talk today is on transnational feminist research methodology in the context of decolonizing or indigenizing Ghanaian psychology, which is part of our work in furthering women's rights. Psychology's relevance is predicated on how solidly it is rooted in the cultural philosophies of the people it's intended to serve. Ghanaian psychology, largely westernized, has failed to incorporate contextual cultural factors into explanations of psychological phenomenon. This leaves indigenous knowledge systems and folk and philosophical psychologies primarily disregarded. Therefore, it lacks the integration of culturally specific philosophical positions on the human experience and causes of behavior. For example, Ghanaians possess a resilient respect for traditional religious beliefs regarding ancestors, animistic spirits, and other supernatural forces. To the African, spirituality is of the ultimate relevance to the being. It is perhaps a pivotal point of human existence. However, devoid of indigenous philosophies, psychology cannot adequately address the psychological and spiritual foundations of violence against women and witchcraft victimization and gender discrimination across cultures, particularly in Ghana. I propose decolonized best practices for conducting transnational feminist research that support women's liberation and a global realization of human rights. This decolonized approach is grounded within a conceptual framework rooted in intersectionality and feminist liberation psychology, as well as a personal experience gained from a recent cross-cultural research collaboration in Ghana. To clarify, by decolonize, I am referring to the infusion of indigenous ideas, values, and practices while working to deconstruct patriarchal structures and influences. Feminist liberation psychology calls for an accounting of the social conditions enmeshed in global structures of gender inequality throughout all levels of society. And intersectionality is a term used to describe lived experience through the lens of multiple intersecting factors and identities, specifically those associated with oppression. And this term was first introduced as part of the discourse surrounding critical race theory. Decolonial feminist scholars have proposed that women's experience in the majority world is inextricably linked to the systemic inequities of global power structures, such as colonialism, capitalism, and other patriarchal systems. However, much of the initial body of intersectionality literature within psychology has primarily reflected a Western bias, which is not generalizable to women in the majority world, and it has not provided a sufficient understanding of gendered injustice across cultures. We propose that a decolonized, transnational feminist approach to research methodology could allow for a more robust understanding of how women extend their agency to challenge power-based structural barriers. Transnational feminism initially emerged as an act of resistance to neoliberalism and universalizing feminisms, and supports the position that researchers should take a scholar-activist approach to methodology, as history tells us that activist women were perhaps the most significant influence on developing intersectional ideas. Historically, psychology has primarily examined gender as universal comparisons between men and women. This approach assumes that women across cultures and geographic locations have the same experiences, thereby disregarding the influence of intersecting identities. This approach ignores how gender injustice occurs at many levels, and it's insufficient to the cause. The following proposed framework highlights the psychosocial process that contribute to oppression instead of merely focusing on the biological aspects of sex. First of all, these processes require local knowledge and experience. Researchers should take a collaborative approach by partnering with local women for all aspects of the project. Research informed by community participation allows for the amplification of subjugated knowledge. It centers Indigenous contributions, and it highlights the importance of collective efforts towards social change. When the research questions are determined by the investigator, the population's needs and cultural specificities can be further subjugated. The subject of investigation should be identified by those women who have been marginalized, thereby reflecting their unique lived experience. Also, research tells us that women are more likely to be successful in changing their circumstances when they are also active in dismantling the power structures that have oppressed them. Further, I propose a mixed design research methodology, integrating qualitative and quantitative research methodologies, which work to diversify social identity categories, which allows for an investigation of multiple influences. Attention should be given to the possible further marginalization that could occur due to power imbalances. Ethical transnational feminist research should provide for an intellectual exchange that privileges the knowledge that arises from the individuals for whom the research is meant to serve. This knowledge should have the express goal of amplifying marginalized voices. Some might call this emancipatory knowledge, with the goal of liberating the oppressed rather than furthering the academic career of the researchers. As scholar activists, we hope to continue collaborative work to decolonize research methods within feminist psychology and realize gendered social justice and human rights for women across the globe. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. First of all, I want to ask all the participants to come into the gallery mode so we can all see each other and maybe put on your video if you like. And second of all, I want to thank all the presenters for these really, really interesting presentations. I really enjoy being moderator of this panel. And I now want to open up a discussion, and if there are any questions coming from the audience or from the other presenters to our presenters, please feel free just to raise your hand and ask a question or to put it in the chat. Okay, I don't see any hands coming up. Oh, Mary?
Sure. Yes. First of all, I just want to say this was really an inspiring session. There were so many perspectives, again, like the symposium before this, converging on the same kinds of ideas, from the conceptual level to the methodological level. So I just want to say this was really wonderful and holistic, but I do have a specific question on the decolonization of psychological statistics. And it's maybe whether you can speak to why moving to R would make a difference. I understand about decentering. You want the norm not to be assumed, but why moving from a system like SPS to a system like R might or should or will make a difference in how we think about research.
There's one answer in the chat, but
that wasn't my talk, but I did want to say R is free.
I mean, I understand that R is free, but I guess for those of us who are new to this or who are naive about it, what does R do that SPS doesn't do? What if they were both free? What does R do that makes it more conducive to thinking about research in less structured ways or colonial ways?
Yeah, I'm wondering right now if there are any of the presenters of this talk right now here. There are a lot of people. I don't see everybody.
It's actually a really wonderful question. I know I hopped on late, but I don't even know what R is. And I'm like, oh, there's something else. So hearing a bit more about that in general, or like doing more research would be awesome, or hearing more about it. But.
Well, maybe we all have some homework to do.
I was going to say R is a free source statistics program, much like SPSS. But everyone can source the code and you can write your own code. And so it's, SPS is very controlled too, and it's very expensive
Okay,
and
so
difficult to use.
So it's liberalizing the statistical tools, is that?
I think so. From my perspective and teaching statistics, I think R is giving that to everybody. Before, it was just a very privileged position. If you were connected to a university or you had more money or more education, then you could get SPSS because it's very expensive. But now any researcher can use it anywhere in the world and learn to use it. And then they can provide their data, for the rest of the world. R has a really good depository for people to put their data, so you can go and look at it, like online.
I think Andy wanted to say something. And
yeah, and in fact, I'm going to ask Aaron, isn't it more conducive for using Bayesian analyses? R?
No,
Thank you.
No, that coding is too complicated.
Chris gave a thumbs up, so
yeah, maybe Chris can answer that.
I think Elaine wants to say something. I think she also.
One way in which SPSS tends to enforce a certain level of, I regret to say colonization, but certainly limitations, is that, for instance, when we teach levels of measurement, you have the ratio scale, the interval scale, the ordinal scale, and the nominal scale. SPS automatically collapses racial and interview. Now, I work with intelligence, and intelligence, I spend a lot of time saying why intelligence should not be measured on a racial scale. But SPSS collapses that. So intelligence is treated as a ratio measure instead of an interval measure. So that's one way in which I experience SPSS as controlling my data when I may not want to do something. So I would just throw that out as an example.
Thank you very much. Chris also wanted to say something.
I just like to give thumbs up whenever Andy says something.
Okay, all right. I know that. Okay, are there any more questions coming from the audience? I have a question which kind of goes to all of the presenters, and that is that I've heard a lot in all the talks about how it is important to involve the participants more into designing your research. And I was wondering if some of you could explicify this a bit, maybe what are the benefits for the participants, what are the benefits for the research, and yeah.
I can speak to that a little bit, Vera. It's important that the knowledge is the knowledge that the people need, and they know what they need. So for us to go into another community cross-culturally and say, we've come to study this topic or this construct is not appropriate. That's a further form of oppression and colonization. But asking, I have these skills, I've been privileged enough to get this doctoral education, and I do have these skills with research and statistics. How can I help you lead? You lead this project. You lead, from your cultural perspective. You you inspire, you inform. So we used a community participatory approach when I went to Ghana this summer. And I met Dr. Faith in Ghana. She's fantastic. I see that she's jumped on. And we asked our colleagues there, and tell us how we can help. How can we collaborate? What do you need? What knowledge do you need? What information you need? Like, what is the problem? And I think that's a very important perspective to take, because in the past, it's just been, oh, we took this trip to, the global south and we gave this is what we found. I'm like, well, how does that help anyone? Did you talk to anyone there about how they need to be helped? And so I think that's an important perspective to take.
Thank you. Monica raised her hand.
Yeah, and I think that was so beautifully said in so many ways, in that like a lot of research in the past, I think, has always focused on or been hi, as an outsider, this is what I think you should do and fix it. and that, there was this very performative or very inaccurately placed or colonialized kind of approach to let me fix you and your perspectives, and rather than using or utilizing or incorporating the actual groups being impacted, their perspectives and their knowledge. And so, oftentimes when I've read a lot of prior research, it seems to have been very much like, oh, well, we did all this research, but the limitation is the community doesn't want to use it. And I'm like, well, no, duh, because you didn't actually consult and utilize the community and their strengths and their awareness and how to approach them. So something even as basic as making sure we're using the right terminology, that community actually uses, the language that community actually uses, can make a massive difference in addressing and understanding what's even going on. And I'm really happy, and I was very excited when I saw the list of talks, and I'm so bummed I couldn't watch it, but that all of these had this focus of how do we actually go from telling communities what to do to being a part of and incorporating those communities into our studies and research, because I think that's a huge thing that our field still has to work towards.
Thank you.
So I have a question for those of you who are doing this research. At least in my naive view, anthropologists have been doing this for a long time, or at least anthropologists have been attempting to integrate themselves within communities and look at communities' perceptions. They're not necessarily oriented in addressing, identifying, or solving problems, I don't think. But I know there's been a lot of criticism of anthropologists as well. So maybe I would find it really helpful to understand how the attempt to understand the community's terminology, perspectives, and issues is important, but it's probably not sufficient. And then my question would be, what else does one as a researcher need to do to address the longer term goals of not being colonial, not imposing structures?
That's a good question, Mary. I'm trying to digest it into like one sort of thing, but I was thinking more of an example of how doing research in other countries, how we often take our Western measures and we take those in. Oh, here we developed these on a bunch of old white guys, and we think that they measure the same constructs in your culture that they measure in this one. And so one of the drives is to, it's not, you can't, in my opinion, you can't decolonize, but you can re-indigenize. You can bring the indigenous back. As we were saying earlier today, I don't think that we can ever escape the fact that colonialism happened. It's there, it's influenced us. It's part of our history, but now we can use the knowledge, take the good things from it, and indigenize it so that it is serving on a more global perspective. For example, just a simple measure like the post-traumatic growth inventory. Those questions, when looked at in some cultures, are like, these are crazy. We don't think of these constructs this way. And so that data doesn't mean anything. So again, that's just another way of pulling back those things from those structures, and then letting guiding, like I have this knowledge that we could talk about how to psychometrically validate something, but you need to lead. So letting the other people lead, not being the leader.
Thank you. Elaine also raised her hand again.
Yes, I just wanted to point out, maybe as a member of a minority culture, that it's a matter of respect and cooperation. I think it's basic common sense. You do not need psychology to understand that a person who's come up in a protected society has a different lived experience than someone who has not. And the question is simply, is the person who has the power in the privileged society, if they really want to work with that other society, they have to ask, what are the differences? How can I help you? So this is happening in therapy, because the cross-cultural issue with therapists is that, minorities walk into therapy and they get no help. In fact, they get damaged. I unfortunately knew of one colleague who literally got sick in New York because she was alone and she was in supervision, and the therapist, her supervisor, just didn't respect her, had no idea of her culture, and she was just vulnerable and was damaged by it. So this is really fundamental to psychology coming to an awakening of what its true purpose is. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Thank you very much. Andy raised his hand, and then.
Oh, thanks, Vera. I just want to add to that we also have literature that says, not only do we need to ask, but if there's someone on the either intervention team or the research team that doesn't kind of represent the group that you're interested in, you won't get the same data. So like literally studies are showing that, like, if a white man walks into an organization and there's a Black woman in the organization and he asks her experience, and then he brings in his colleague who's a Black woman and she asks the woman, they get different data. So our awareness has to extend to the entire process of gathering data, not just being open to what we hear. We have to be kind of mindful of how much we bias the data we get with that just by our identity present. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you very much. I think the next was Josephine and then Monica.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on the thread of conversation about, cross-cultural dyadic pairing in therapy. So I work with Indigenous people, and when I first started, I had no idea anything about cultural psychology, so I was really flying blind. So I learned kind of the hard way, if you might say so, learning to question myself and what I've learned in psychology. But one thing I found to be very useful was to talk to the clients about their culture and learn a little bit more. And once I did that, they just open up, because it shows an openness and willingness to learn. And that was how I started to connect with them. And they found that I wasn't so strange after all, not being from the culture. And they were so happy to just talk about it. And not only that, but we framed all the conversations in the clinical discourse within their context. So they not only learned something in therapy, but I was learning a lot in return from them as well.
Thank you. Monica, please.
And that's such a beautiful kind of segue, because I think one of the interesting things with anthropology specifically being brought up was that anthropology originally was very often used, again, in a very colonial sense of like, how is this place so different from me? And let me go in and fix and change. So a lot, as we know, a lot of science has founded or started in this place of like, as an additional or different tool for oppression, and the fact that there's a lot of change happening is incredible. But one professor at my school, when they were talking about this, they kind of said, they looked at the question of how can I help? And they're like, but it's a lot more than just that question. It's in what ways can I help and what is actually helpful? Because I think when we talk about identity development in general, it's so easy to talk about a very specific aspect of like white identity development and this changing and progress. And we forget that as psychologists or aspiring psychologists or students in the mental health field, that we have access to a lot of information that most people don't, and we make different use and sense of it than the general public does. And we often fall into the trap of, well, I've seen so many clients, I've been exposed to so many things that I do understand, because we kind of naturally, we forget that we've had to progress to this point, and we forget that there was a whole progression process we had to go through to get there. And I think that is one of the things that when we're talking about these changes that need to happen in the field, it's that reminder that just because we have all of this education or access or information doesn't mean we actually know better or more. And it doesn't actually mean necessarily that we are providing the help that is truly needed. We're providing the help that from our educated or our perspectives tell us needs to be helped. And that's usually where the big like hiccups happen in anthropology and sciences in general. And because of that lack of community contact and understanding, and checking ourselves a little bit. But
thank you. Josephine raised her hand again. Please go ahead. I guess you're muted.
This is my favorite topic. I think we also want to ask, do they even need our help? I mean, if we see a problem, do they even see it as a problem? Maybe they don't need our help. So here we are rushing in, and I think we have somebody, Irma wrote down, reminds me of the quote, fools rush in where angels fear the threat. Well-meaningly, we rush in, but we may be actually be causing more harm, right? So in Canada, when it comes to Indigenous research, we don't tell them what they need. They tell us what they need. We stand on the sidelines and they tell us what they need, whether they want our help and what kind of help they need from us and how to go about, going to address the problem. And so this is the model that I heard from an elder, which has sort of guided me throughout all my work with Indigenous peoples, is that we can walk with them, we can walk behind them, but we can never walk in front of them. And I found that to be very useful.
Thank you very much. Elaine raised her hand next, so please. You're still muted. Elaine?
Yeah,
no.
sorry. I just wanted to make a distinction between help in a practical sense and help in a psychological sense. When I did my clinical internships, I worked with a team of people, social worker, the psychiatrist who was the head honcho, as well as some field people. And over and over and over again, I saw the critical role of practical assistance. And I would not pretend that any advice that I could give replaces that. Both are needed. So I just want to make that distinction, that we can make a decision about some things that are needed because money, housing, certain conditions. But on the other hand, a recent study, I'm sorry I can't quote it, but it was done in one of the developing countries, and they discovered that just giving people a certain amount of money, making their lives not in extreme poverty, made a huge difference. So I would just throw that out as an example, because I don't want us to think that in developing countries don't need any help. There's certain kinds of help that they very rarely need. So I just wanted to throw that out.
Thank you. Mary raised her hand. Please.
Yes, thank you. So I want to give kudos to the last two sets of comments, but I was going to comment on something a little bit different. We're talking about doing research sometimes with other groups as being a matter of helping or not helping, but we as psychologists are also basic scientists, and sometimes we want to simply understand what is. So I think the question of doing more fundamental, not outcome-driven research, again, with non-Western populations is it's challenging and it's tricky, but I don't want to leave out the piece that there are some really important collaborations and learning experiences simply in asking questions about how reality is perceived, how identity is formed, how parenting happens, et cetera. That where the question of giving help or not giving help doesn't come up, although too often it intrudes. So that was one thing. And I also just wanted to follow up Josephine's comment about shoes. I think for a long time, the mantra in many places, but especially in psychology, was we are all the same. You know, we're a human family, we're all the same. And I think that has gotten us into trouble because certainly if you look across cultures, there are many important ways in which we are not all the same. And there were the words of I think he was a Japanese wise man who said something in the same, walking before, walking behind, but also keep the message, you can never truly stand in someone else's shoes. And I think it's really important for us as researchers to remember that. So that was all.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Elaine, please go ahead.
I want to thank Mary for that insightful comment, but to also point out that in times like COVID, we sometimes have to get out of our research heads and get into our activity heads.
Yeah.
So that's not always controlled. I think there are ethical and moral issues that sometimes force that decision.
Great.
Thank you. Monica,
One
please
last
go ahead.
I was like listening and I got so excited about that, just because one of the things that I think I'm currently a doctoral student, so I'm still going through the process and doing my own dissertation. And I'd realized while doing that very fundamental aspect of understanding, like it seems like that has changed in the dissertation process at a lot of universities, where it's shifted from, hey students, just like grow to learn and understanding, and that's the contribution you make, to a lot of students, including my own cohort mates, coming with like trying to find solutions to some major issues. And I think that is one shift a lot of graduate programs could potentially hopefully make, and I think are making, of moving from find this massive piece to like just understand, like just find and understand and explore rather than fix anything. I'm hoping that's the process the graduate programs end up going.
Yes, please, Elaine.
I would say neurological psychology has definitely provided psychologists with a path to increased understanding, and it has impacted the culture a great deal. So there is definitely room for that, and that's where I agree very much with what Mary pointed out. And that's one area in which I would say we have to go for understanding first. So I would just say that.
Thank you. Yeah, are there any more comments on this topic? Yeah, Polly, please. Go ahead, unmute yourself, please. Polly, you're still muted. We can't hear you. That's it.
Sorry, I'm still listening. I forget it, all the techniques. You know, this understanding to stay next to your client or to the people you research. I don't know a better word, but you know, if you are doing research among a group of people, you know, this understanding and this level of standing not above but together. I remember the first comment I got from my supervisor when I started my practice is, be aware of eagerness. We always, especially when we feel powerless, we want to help and we want to get results and so on. But sometimes it takes time and then we have to trust the power of people self and the resilience they come up with the solutions so often. And to talk about cultural issues, it's also to be very much aware of not othering the client. You know, that, oh, that's a client from a different culture. There you start already. It's a human being to start with, endure. And that's with all the context and all the history and all the culture, they're coming to your client's rooms. So I must thank you so much for all the wonderful presentations. Gives a lot to think about.
Yeah, thank you, Polly. Nancy.
I just
please
wanted
go
to do
ahead.
what Polly said. It was really fun. I had the privilege of listening to some of these talks before today, and to listen to them again today. And you know, they're very rich and they're very dense. In 5 minutes, a lot is said. So I really thank everybody for a great session.
Thank you. Josephine, do you also want to say something?
No, what I wanted to say really was just to congratulate all the presenters. We really learned a lot today, and look at all the rich discussion that it has generated. And I think that's the reason why we are here for the conference. It's not only just to learn, but also to further, the field and to ask more critical questions. And I think that the Lightning Talks today have really been very successful in doing that. So I want to thank all the presenters.
Yeah, I can only agree.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.